Hello and welcome to Business on the Wire. I'm Mitali Mukherjee. The Financial Times calls him a global intellectual. Not that the name needs much introduction or context, but Nobel laureate Dr. Amartya Sen is widely known and regarded for the body of work he's created around development economics, welfare economics, and so much of what people who look at economic thought today look at. He has now taken a little bit of a turn in his writing and has moved towards the personal rather than the professional. In his recently released book, Home in the World, a memoir, Dr. Sen traverses the journey of his younger days, starting and moving from Shantiniketan and Kolkata in West Bengal to Dhaka in Bangladesh to Myanmar, and of course to his years at Trinity in Cambridge. This book is a delightful journey not just through his younger days, but also through what shaped and influenced his thought and what has really given birth to the way he sees the world in a social and economic prism, all the influences that were so important in his life. Joining me now is Dr. Sen himself to talk about his book and, more importantly, to talk about all the lessons that we can draw to the here and now for India and its economic and social state. Thank you, Dr. Sen, for joining in and speaking with me. My first question could possibly be the last question to have asked you, but I was curious to know why you stopped your story at 33. Is there a sequel that your readers can look forward to? Is that why the book stopped at the very pivotal age of 33 for you? Or 33 years were
Well,
covered, rather? Yeah.
the book was about my childhood, which began in Burma and then it had Dhaka in it, now in Bangladesh, and Shantiniketan and Kolkata, and then, of course, Cambridge and a bit of America. But I was still, in a sense, um, a student. And in what happened in 1963 is I went back to India, started being a teacher, and I was teaching in the Delhi School of Economics. I had a new student, some very brilliant student, and it was a transition from being a teacher, from being a student to being a teacher. And I think that's the time that seemed to me to be a good moment to stop because I was spending most of my time at that moment in preparing lectures, trying to decide how I could motivate my students. And of course, as it happened among my students, emerged uh, some really greatly creative intellectuals. And I could see that my role now has become primarily that of a teacher, not that of a student anymore. And in some way, that seemed to Italy a good moment to stop when I'm transiting. And then my life since then has been primarily that of a teacher, as it is even now. At the age of 88, I'm still correcting exams, talking with students, answering their questions, and trying to cater myself to doing teaching as well as I can.
Yes.
So it's that transition moment.
Yes. I cannot think of a greater legacy than being a teacher, though, Dr. Sen. If you permit me, there are
Well,
many.
I'm very flattered to hear it.
As I went through your book, sir, I found that there were many parallels or stepping stones between what we're living through now versus what you lived through many years back. So, if you permit me, I'd like to go through some of those experiences and sort of tie it in with the here and now. The first one I wanted to talk about is education, where you have written in great detail about your school years. And you write particularly about the Shantiniketan experience, saying that it was a period where that exceptional importance of the combination of freedom and reason has remained with you all your life. It struck me, though, Dr. Sen, that this is perhaps the most difficult period that students in India are living through, having lost close to 2 years of an academic experience, by not being able to visit physical school, by losing out on the learning and the interaction. How important do you think early education is, and are you worried about the impact that India's school children may face because of having lost these last 2 years?
Well, Mitali, that's an excellent question. And the short answer is yes, I'm worried, very worried. But it's not just what happened under COVID and the pandemic that we are experiencing. The schooling system in India has been so inadequate, so defective, that even when there is no pandemic, the school system doesn't quite deliver what it should. I was lucky because Shantiniketan, it wasn't a spectacular school in the way that the great schools in Calcutta or Dhaka are, or Delhi are. It was spectacular only in giving students the freedom to go around the library, open shelf library. You go up and down up to the fifth floor. You also ask the teachers any question that comes to you, whether or not it's connected with the syllabus. And you think up what question you would like to answer. And that may not be about India, it could be about China or Japan or Africa or Latin America, and not just India and the inferior power that was written in my school days, namely when I was a student in the British Empire, but I didn't have to confine myself. But on the other hand, things that are taught now are often extremely regimented. And sometimes we hear of extraordinary lapses from true knowledge. For example, if you want to do mathematics, you ought to do mathematics in the best possible tradition that includes, of course, past Indian mathematics, but it also includes Greek mathematics, Babylonian mathematics, Arab mathematics in a big way, the Chinese mathematics, and so on. And all these are matters in which we need freedom. But if these are guided by nationalism rather than pride in the art of mathematics and the science of applying mathematics, then I think you're making a big mistake. So I think that problem has been present in a big way, and it increased a lot over the last decade. And those problems remain. And even though quite often people think of the school problem as only that of not having a good English or something like that, I never went to an English medium school. Throughout my school days, my medium of instruction was only Bengali. I don't think that had maimed me altogether, but it would have maimed me if I had to follow only what the English wanted us to study, and which was in many ways the case in the British Empire. where I was being schooled. That is a huge problem. And if that continues, then there is um, a connection that is not good for education that gives the greatest scope for freedom, for independent reflection, and so on. So I think there are all kinds of problems going beyond the narrow concern with the medium of instruction and so on, which is repeated again and again. But there are bigger problems. And there's so many other big problems that in the British days, all my uncles, my on my father's side and my mother's side were in jail on grounds of preventive detention, not because they have done anything wrong, but under grounds that they could do something wrong, and the British didn't want that. Now, I didn't expect that to continue in India, but of course it does. And initially, even after independence under Congress government, but increasingly more and more. And the use of UAPA is not only bad for individual freedom, it's bad for understanding what education should consist of. So in all kinds of ways, there are problems that we have to tackle. And to that has been added the problems generated by COVID and the lack of schooling, schools being often closed, teachers being absent, and so on. These are problems, yes. But these are not our only problems.
No, absolutely, sir. Um, in fact, I think one of the most moving chapters that you have written about is when you write about the Bengal famine that you saw firsthand. And so much of what you write over there strikes a chord with what many in India are living through today. Whether it is the fact that there is not enough food supply or the fact that people are dealing with extremely high inflation. What is your sense, Dr. Sen, of this condition that we have going, where we have a deeply inequitous society and we have steadily rising inflation? I mean, it's worldwide, of course, but in a country like India, it hurts the general population much more.
Well, I think one of the things to recognize that the Bengal famine, which killed between 2 and 3 million people, took place at a time when the supply of food wasn't particularly low. It wasn't greatly lavish, but it wasn't famine-like in terms of supply constraint. And there was the inflation too, but the inflation was connected with causes that were within human control. We were during the war at that time, the Second World War, and there was enormous amount of expenditure by the British military, the Indian Indo-British or Indian under British military. There were aerodromes being constructed everywhere. The expenditure led to a demand pressure over a limited quantity of food. It's not primarily the lack of food, but it's the demand pressure on an inflexible amount of food that generated the inflation and led to the deprivation of those whose income in money terms didn't go up while prices were going up. And the British government was very keen that there be no discontent in urban centers because that would be bad for the war effort. So Calcutta was protected by rationing, but the food was recruited, was um, um, acquired from the rural areas at whatever price was needed. And the result was that the rural prices went up a lot. Rural incomes, by and large, didn't. And the biggest um, group that suffered were rural laborers in a big way. Now, we have a somewhat analogous situation. Every economic problem uh, is has some features of their own, and we have difficulties. Inflation may be a common element in it, but there are many other ways in which things were quite different then than it is now. What was common was often a shared disregard of the interests of the poor, and that was as strong in the 1940s in India and in the case of the famine in Bengal. And as it is often observed today. So uh, we have to look at the respects in which there are similarities and the respect in which there are differences. And we have to look at all of them and try to see what we can do in a way that our intelligent understanding of the past allows us to consider as solutions. There's a lot to be um, thought through on that. There are a lot of very good Indian economists who are thinking about this, but there is need to concentrate on this more, particularly on the part of the governing powers in the country.
Do you believe, sir, that that is the situation for the current government? There is a disregard for the interests of the poor because the the narrative that has been set forth has always been about how it's a very pro poor government and all schemes are aimed at directly providing a better life for the very poor, whether it is the Ujjwala scheme or building toilets. What do you think needs to be corrected in terms of addressing the needs of the poor at this point?
It is very difficult to get the attention of the governing people to concentrate on the interests of the very poor, because the very poor don't have the power to attract the attention of the rich and the powerful. And when the democratic process is weak, this is even more the case. As I was mentioning earlier, the democratic process is very weak at this time, unfortunately, and it's something that's in the interest of everyone in the country to try to remedy. I mentioned earlier UAPA, uh, where people could be arrested on grounds of not that they have done anything wrong, there's not enough proof to bring them to court and get them convicted. That doesn't happen. But you can keep them indefinitely, or certainly a long time, in prison on grounds that they could do um, harm unless they are kept in prison. That was the state of play with my maternal uncles, my paternal uncles, my elderly cousins. They were all in jail by the British Imperial Forces on grounds that they could do harm. I remember asking my grandfather, who was a great friend of mine, and saying, when would it be that we won't have people who are arrested without having committed any crime? And he said, well, not until India is independent. Unfortunately, India is very much independent now, more than 70 years, and that perpetration of inequity still continues. Now, I think ultimately the lack of democracy has a very strong connection with the way that economic equity is dealt with by the government and how much interest people get um, when the government thinks about problems. When there was a lockdown, you were mentioning COVID, when there was a lockdown in in Delhi or Bombay or Calcutta, suddenly people were uh, told that they can't go out of their home. Now, for people who have to earn a living by daily labor, not to be go out, not to be able to go out of the home, is like an order to starve. Similarly, people who are far away from their home, from Bihar, they may have come to Delhi, but of course, suddenly, if they can't go anywhere, they would like to go home, but if the trains are closed, buses are closed, and they have to try to walk back to Bihar from Delhi, which is not an easy thing, um, you would be in great difficulty. But underlying that is the question, it's clear that this is the problem. Why is it that it didn't get as much attention as it should have? And that would happen when the interests of the poor are not prominent in the political process, which is basically one way or another lack of democracy. So I think we have to think about how to expand the democratic force in the country and the way that the country has proceeded over the last decade or so is exactly in the opposite direction. It's weakening of democracy rather than strengthening of that. And that's not only bad in terms of people's immediate suffering, but it's also bad in allowing economic equity to be dissolved, to be badly handled without there being a remedial political process. There are ability that Indians have to protest about these things, whether it be farmers or any other group of people who are determined. But when the democratic process uh, doesn't help and tends to hinder, that could be a very big barrier to economic equity as such. I'm not just saying that a particular one problem solution is what we are needing. We need all kinds of different things, but yet among them, the lack of uh, freedom, the lack of democracy, the lack of the ability to take a reasoned decision, these play a part. And this we should know. The odd thing is that so many of these problems had occurred under British Empire, and we are repeating some of the worst mistakes of the empire. They were after all imprisoned in the imperial ideology, but we need not be imprisoned uh, in that way today. So we do want more freedom, more ability to use reason.
In your chapter about your lived experiences with the freedom struggle, Dr. Sen, you write saying nothing is perhaps as important as the functioning of a multi party democracy and a free press. As I read those lines, I could not but think about the situation we live in now, where there is a third element which many point to, which is the manipulation of democratic institutions. Do you feel that has become a third challenge for India's democracy? The fact that institutions have now been manipulated in a sense, There are question marks around the election commission's functioning, or the judiciary's functioning, or the enforcement directorate's functioning. And what do you think the impact of that kind of manipulation is on a country?
Yeah, I think this is a very good question that you're asking me, Tali. Um, Certainly, multi-party democracy is very important, but the question is why? The reason is that if there is one party that becomes dominant, then it can do what it likes. It has its majority wherever it is in parliament and so on. And it can make um, the executive, I mean, parliament is legislature, but the legislature could end up having a dominant influence on the executive, on the bureaucracy, and ultimately on the judiciary too. Depends on how compliant the judiciary is. And in India, and even in the high courts, Supreme Courts, we have had varying experiences, as we do know. So we have to think about the importance of democracy for legislature, for um, um, uh, executive, as well as for judiciary. But on top of that, if we want to look at the executive, we have to see the role of institutions. If the executive begins to exercise power in an unbalanced, in an unjust way, then it could make a big difference. This is not something that India did not have uh, uh, right from the beginning. Unfortunately, many of the institutions, even in the earlier period of the Congress rule, had limitations. Books were banned. Salman Rushdie's book was first country to ban it was India. There have been uh, uh, injustices even earlier. But the extent of these injustices went dramatically up when these institutions were increasingly taken over by the functioning of the central government. And when that happened, then independence is not only independence is lost, but also education suffers, the ability to speak up, and therefore talk about economic rights, political rights, social rights suffer. The people at the bottom of the scale, the Dalits and the tribal poor, go through a terrible time, and all these lead to a heaping of inequity, injustice uh, over each other. And that we have to certainly change. Now, we have, to some extent, been able to maintain some of the freedom, but after all, in my state, West Bengal, the uh, the the threat that it will be taken over, the independence that locals have should be taken over by the central government, didn't materialize. And there is a certain amount of power that the democratic system has. And yet, as you point out, the Electoral Commission is often criticized with justice as not doing as much as it could for having a fair election, for choosing the dates of the election, not according to the convenience of one party, but of all. So we live in a system which not uh, totally bankrupt. It has very big effects and bad effects. And Mitali, you are exactly right in pointing out that we have to be concerned about them. And we should. And I think that's why I do think that the issue of democracy is central to all these questions, to economics, to social justice, to education, all these things. And the situation has in many ways worsened rather than improved. And I'm proud of being an Indian. We have a long tradition of talking about the ability of different groups to speak to each other, holding their head high. Ashoka wrote about that and put various inscriptions even on stone across the country and sometimes beyond. Uh, the when when in Rome, uh, in Campo di Fiori, the heretics were being burnt um, because they were heretics. In India, in uh, Akbar was able to lecture in Agra on the need for the state having a equitable attitude to different religions. And as Akbar put it, every person pursuing his own religion should be free to do so, and the state should protect them in case there is an attempt to interfere with that. Well, we have seen a lot of interference lately, in fact, even suggesting that members of some community are particularly disfavored. When that happens, the court has a responsibility to do something. When that happens, the opposition has or should have the power to come into it. So I think it's the ultimately it is a question of equality or equity involving not just economics and incomes and wealth, but also political power, social power, and not social discrimination against one group, whether it be tribal or a minority religion um, rather than another. All these are part of the process of remedy that we need, both for its own sake, because equity is so important, and for the sake of the extent to which economic, political, educational um, equity that people can enjoy depends on equity and equality in a broader sense. India has every reason to be proud of many things that happened in the past, and many of them much earlier. In some ways, the practice of democracy had a trial in India long time ago, like in Greece, where Greece has also many reasons to be proud. We too, but when instead of taking pride, we try to do the opposite. We are not being loyal to history and not being loyal to India. I'm an Indian citizen, despite all the difficulties I have in standing in long queues to get a visa, to be able to visit countries and so on. And I will remain so. Why do I want to stay an Indian despite all the difficulties? I could have become an American or British extremely easily. It's because I am proud of being an Indian. I'm proud of our heritage, our history. I'm proud of what we stood for and what we can stand for today. And is that pride, when I see it's gone, instead of that, we see a kind of demeaning hostility, demeaning anger, demeaning discrimination, demeaning denial of freedom to people. When we see that, I have to stand up, even though at 88, I'm not very strong to stand up, but I should try to do as much as I can. And so should, I believe, everyone in India. It is part of our responsibility, part of our duty as the inheritor of a extraordinarily rich tradition.
Those are very inspiring and moving words, Dr. Sen. I want to go back for a minute to the point you made about a thriving opposition or a thriving judiciary, because the experience of the last few years has shown us that any big change has actually happened via peaceful protest that did not have a particular leader or a particular party, whether it was the farmers' movement or the opposition to the CAA. What do you think will help us find balance in the years to come? Will it continue to be mass led peaceful protests? Or is there another way to find some kind of balance in terms of this deep social and economic disparity that we are seeing?
It's again, like every question you're asking me, Sally, an excellent question. I think we need both because when there is a problem, we know, and we first have to know what is the problem being caused by. That requires intelligent analysis. That requires investigation. That requires intellectual uh, exercise of our minds. On top of that, we need to do some action. And the question arises, what action is it that we ought to do? And how would they come about? And third question is, and if we need leadership for that, where is the leadership going to come? Would be very lucky if the um, uh, judiciary did that, and sometimes it does do that. Other times it has been lamentably a failure, but sometimes great success. And so the judiciary can play that very big part. There is also the potential for that all the time through public agitation. When public agitation suggests that we are not doing the things that we ought to do. I am also not a believer that people cannot ever be changed. If there are some people who are being rather narrow minded and who may be majoritarian in a very narrow sense and treating minorities badly, I think that's a very unfortunate thing to happen. But we still have reason to demand that narrow-minded majoritarianism should not survive. And quite often it's not even majoritarianism, because the Indian, as we had known over the years, beginning from the time of independence, even earlier, that majority in India has not been offensive about minorities. There we have the Hindus and Muslims and the Sikhs and the Parsis and Christians have lived together for hundreds of years without great difficulty about having the coexistence of different religions next to each other. So there is, so a majority can be constructed which is inspired by ideas of, of of equity, of justice, in a way that Gandhiji or Rabindranath Tagore and many others have tried to suggest that we should be. So I think we should go in that direction. Sometime a leadership of a particular kind is very important. If it's difficult to think what would have happened if, say, the leadership of Mahatma Gandhi did not come in the way of the agitating Indians trying to get independence. Uh, Someone who could say that we're not Hindus, we're not Muslim. In fact, when Gandhiji went in the 1930s for a meeting in London, and he was introduced as the leader of the Hindu group, he said, I'm not. I stand for everyone, Indians, who could be Hindus, who could be Muslim, who could be Christian. And then he pointed out that if you divide it, Sarojini Naidu was there, is the only woman here. So if you were to give me the role of being leader of Hindus, you should give Sarojini Naidu the role of being leader of half the country, because she was the only woman present here. The clarity of thinking that Gandhiji presented before he was killed in a public place, the clarity of thinking about the world, about Indians, about foreigners, about everyone, about the Chinese, Japanese, the British, the Germans, and the Americans that Rabindranath Tagore gave. We needed that. Now, I think the need for leadership is not going to go away, but the need to stand up on your own, to say, there's a lovely song of Tagore, that if people don't respond to your request to join, then you have to go alone. And that's an important thought. And so we have to be ready to go alone, but we have to be ready also to generate leadership that can lead us in the right direction. It's a very complicated situation. On the other hand, it's much more complicated to think about than to practice. And we have practiced it again and again in the country, and we can do so again in the future, I hope.
Judito Dakyo Shunina Ashe. I think that's the one you're alluding to, sir.
Yeah.
I have a final question for you, and thank you for being so patient with me. For me personally, I think the chapter that left the most impression on me was when you detailed your journey with cancer, the vulnerability with which you've written about how you first identified it and then dealt with it. I think has so many important lessons for people living through a third wave of a pandemic and wondering about the uncertainty of life. What is it that you would want to tell people who, and for many of us, this is the first time we're dealing with a pandemic in our living years. What is it that one should hold on to? In terms of looking out and looking ahead and looking beyond the last 2.5 years that have been difficult for everyone in varying degrees.
Well, I think the very big thing about any human tragedy that is generated by things happening within the country, um, for any of them, it's important to ask why it's happening and what can we do about it. That applies to as much to the pandemics as it did to the Bengal famine or as it did to the riots that covered India preceding independence in 1947. We have to think what's causing this and what can we do about it. Now, the pandemics is a very big problem, and we know not only from the present experience, which has been dire, but also from earlier experiences like the epidemic of flu or epidemics that I remember even as a child, of cholera, of malaria, of typhoid, of smallpox. They could uh, make life unbearably nasty, and full of death, full of horror, and full of um, uh, uh, essentially genocide by medical forces. Now, we have lived through them and we have often conquered them. We will conquer the COVID and pandemics also, but we cannot do it unless we think clearly. When we think about pandemics, if we think only about the rich and not about the poor, we will not be making a progress. If we tell people that we are uh, putting you down as lockdown, unfortunately, that would mean I can't let you get out of your home. Uh, if you say that, that will show some sensitivity, but it would overlook the fact that many people do not have a home into which you can keep them confined. Their home may be far away in their villages, in uh, many hundreds of miles away, or they may be living or sleeping on the street and so on. So we have to consider the variety of conditions that lead to our suffering, taking many different shapes and forms. And we have to pay attention to all of them. Because if we pay attention only to one group of people, no matter how sympathetic we sound, saying, I'm sorry, there is going to be lockdown. Uh, Lockdown is not the only problem that people have. So we have to think broadly. So I think this is, um, uh, I think no one probably spoke about it with as much clarity as Gautam Buddha did in 6th century BC. Namely, our problems are different. When Gautam Buddha left his home to try to achieve salvation through denial of, of, uh, of eating and other pleasures, and came out by saying that you cannot uh, think more clearly, improve the mind by starving the body. You have to think about what the problems are of people, and then you could find a solution. So he went around different parts of our country, India, demanding that we think about each other, about the sufferings that we have, and put understanding, knowledge. Buddha is derived from buddhi, that is, it's concerned with um, reflection, understanding, reasoning, and so on. So I think we have a long tradition of um, trying to reason our way out and trying to make the best use of reason we can. And I think we should do that. And that reasoning will also teach us that different people have different problems and we have to address them in an appropriate way. Uh, I'm not a nationalist, and I think uh, different countries all have a right to be treated well by other countries. On the other hand, we have been quite lucky in India to have had big sources of wisdom, whether it be Buddha or Gandhi or Tagore or Kabir or Nanak or Shankara. We have had lots of tradition of thinking, which we can make good use of today. And even though you are right, the pandemic looks very new, it isn't really new because it's the suffering of human being is a common thing that's been going on for thousands of years. And we have dealt with them, and we should deal with them again and better. So I'm very glad you asked the question, because um, a sense of paralyzing fear is not what we want. A sense of deliberate understanding of our own strength could be much better way of solving our problems. So I'm very grateful to you for asking that question.
I'm the one who's very grateful and very, very thankful, sir, for all your time and patience. It's been such an honor and pleasure speaking with you. Many congratulations on your book. I'm waiting for a sequel. I think there's
Okay.
plenty more there.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.